Hey friends, welcome to the last video in this series about which universities to apply for with your particular UCAT score. In this video I'm going to be talking about the top 5 universities you should apply for if you have a high UCAT score. Just to remind you, from those 2021 preliminary results, we think that a high UCAT score currently is anything above 680. That puts you in the top 30% of all applicants. Having a high UCAT is beneficial in applying for any university that takes the UCAT, so don't think that you're at a disadvantage with a high UCAT in any of the universities I've previously mentioned in the other videos. The 5 universities in the video today love the UCAT, and historically these are the universities that take people with the highest average UCAT scores. One of the benefits of having a high UCAT score, particularly for these 5 universities, is that it can counteract having slightly worse GCSEs than many of the people applying for medicine. Like in the previous videos, I'm just going to go through these alphabetically. Don't read anything into the order in which I'm telling you these. The first university on this list alphabetically is Barts, otherwise known as Queen Mary University London. When Barts is selecting applicants for interview, they look 50% of the UCAT and 50% of your predicted A-level grades. Those predicted A-level grades are taken and they create a score using UCAS points, which is unlike a lot of other medical schools, and then the UCAT makes up the other 50%. Barts is an example of a university where if you have really high A-levels, it can make do for slightly lower UCAT, but if you have a really high UCAT, it also can counteract slightly lower A-levels. Barts every year releases loads of statistics on the previous year's admission cycle, so check it out in the links below. One thing we can see is that from Barts last year, the highest scoring UCAT which got an offer was 820. However, the lowest scoring UCAT that got an offer was 575. So Barts accepts a really big range. But realise if you have a high UCAT score, that's already going to put you in good standing, almost no matter what your A-levels are. If you're finding this video useful, please make sure you like and subscribe. The second university on this list is Bristol. About 3 years ago, Bristol completely changed the way that they rank applicants for interview. Previously, they looked almost entirely at your personal statement when deciding who would get an interview. Now, they look almost entirely at the UCAT. This means that Bristol's gone from being a university which accepts low UCAT, to a university where you're much more likely to get an interview with a high UCAT. The personal statement can still be used to decide between 2 people with exactly the same score, but the UCAT is going to be the biggest factor. University number 3 on this list is my medical school, King's College London, otherwise known as Guy's, King's and St Thomas's. When King's is looking at who's going to get an interview, they do look at the UCAT, your GCSEs, your A-levels and your personal statement, but they've previously said that the UCAT and potentially your academics are the biggest factors. Historically, people with high UCAT scores are likely to get an interview at King's. People with lower UCAT scores are less likely, although every year there are a few people with quite low UCATs who do get into King's. University number 4 on this list is probably the university that is most well known for loving the UCAT, and that is Newcastle. Historically, Newcastle has been the place to apply to if you have a high UCAT score, and the place to avoid if you have a low UCAT score. That's because they place the biggest emphasis. Thankfully, Newcastle releases a load of information about how they use the UCAT every year, and this year we can have a look at how they've used it for the last 5 years. Last year, so for 2020, for a 2021 application period, the lowest UCAT score to get an interview at Newcastle was 705. The threshold changes every year. It's not a fixed cutoff. They just look at everyone who's applied and they count down through those list of people, and at some point they have to stop giving interviews, and so that's the number that we're given. And last year, if you didn't score above 705 on the UCAT, you weren't selected for the interview process for the 5-year course. Interestingly, if you were applying for graduate entry medicine in Newcastle, you had to get an even higher UCAT. The lowest score on the UCAT that got an interview for graduate medicine last year was 757.5, which is just ridiculously high. The last medical school on this list is Nottingham. Nottingham is another university that absolutely loves the UCAT, and they place a huge emphasis on it when they're selecting people for interview. They use a point system at Nottingham which is very transparent, so luckily you can have a look at their website and work out how many points you think you've got based on your GCSEs and your UCAT score. Nottingham awards 32 points based on your different GCSE results, with the top points going to people who are getting 8s and 9s, and there are 120 points available for the UCAT. So out of the point allocation process of selection for interview, GCSEs make up about 20%, with UCAT making up the other 80%. The way that Nottingham uses the UCAT is very unique to Nottingham. They divide it in 2, with 50% of your points coming from your UCAT mark, the numbers, and 50% of your points coming from your SJT band. This is the only medical school that I know of to place so much emphasis on the SJT. This means that getting a band 1 in the SJT is equivalent to getting a 900 in the UCAT in terms of points. Those 60 points that are available from the numerically marked parts of the UCAT are weighted with twice the amount of points being available for the verbal reasoning. I know I would have struggled with this, that was my worst section. They double the points awarded for the verbal reasoning section, and then all of the others have a weighting of 1. They then allocate points using bands, and so if you score between 800 and 900 in each section, you would get maximum points, and if you score between 300 and 400, you get minimum points. Those points are all then added up, with 32 points coming from GCSEs, 120 points coming from your UCAT, and then they allocate based on the top people. They'll go down the list, and as long as people are meeting the thresholds for their various A-level predicted grades, then they're going to be given interviews. So those are the top 5 universities which, to the best of my knowledge, place the highest weighting on the UCAT. So if you have a very high UCAT, then you're likely to be competitive when applying to these universities. If you've watched the low UCAT score universities, the average UCAT score universities, and now the high UCAT score universities, you probably realise that I haven't mentioned every medical school. The reason for this is because the majority of medical schools fall in the average range. And if you're thinking of applying to a specific medical school, it's always a good idea to look up how they're going to use the various different requirements during the selection process. You can only apply to 4 medical schools each year, and you should have done a lot of research about those 4 before you submit them to UCAS on the 15th of October. If you want to know more about the preliminary results and statistics from the UCAT this year, keep watching and I'll break them down for you. The statistics from today cover everyone that's taken the exam from the start of the testing window until the 12th of September. Now that's just under 17,000 candidates. The main thing most people will be interested in is what was the total mean score for everyone so far. And as of the 12th of September 2021, the mean score was 2,570. That gives a mean average score of 642.5. What that means is if you plotted the bell curve, that middle line on the bell curve should be sitting at 642.5. Another way of thinking about that is that currently, if you got a score of exactly 642.5, then there's probably around 8,500 students who did worse than you, and around 8,500 students who did better than you. What about the individual subsections? For the verbal reasoning, this was yet again the lowest scoring section. I think this is the hardest section. I know it was my hardest section when I sat it. I know lots of you watching this will agree that it's the hardest section for you, and had the lowest average score of 584. At the other end of the spectrum, the quantitative reasoning has again come out as the highest scoring round, and that's 685. Abstract reasoning, which can be quite polarizing. Some candidates will never wrap their head around it unfairly. Some candidates seem to find it easy. The average score for that was 671. And for decision making, the average score was 631. Along with the average scores, the UCAT has also released the deciles for this year. I'm not going to read through all of those. Instead, I'm just going to put them up here for you to have a read through yourself. As you can see, the top 10% of candidates this year got above 2,920. That's an average across all 4 sections of 730, which is really high. The bottom 10% of people were only scoring 2,230 this year, which is an average across the 4 subsections of just under 560. And the last bit of information that we've been told by UCAT is the SJT bands. Now, that's scored in 4 bands, and this year, out of the 17,000 people that have sat the UCAT so far, only 16% of people have managed to get into band 1. 40% of candidates are sitting in band 2, with 32% of candidates in band 3 and 12% of candidates not managing to get above a band 4. As I said already, these are preliminary statistics and they will change by the end of September. Now that we have those deciles, we're able to work out what a high, an average and a low UCAT score are likely to be this year. I think the best way to break that down would say people who scored low on the UCAT are in the bottom 30%, the high would be the top 30%, and the average would be in that 40% in between. Grade boundaries for that this year would be a low score is anything under 605, a high score is anything above 680, and then an average score would be anything between 605 and 680. If you're not someone who scored in the high bracket, make sure you check out this video for the low scores and this video for the average scores this year. At the end of September, the UCAT is going to release their official statistics for all 37,000 students who sat it this year. And at that point, I'll release another video breaking down what the final low, average and high bands are. Subscribe so you don't miss that video.